The rancher had lived most of his life working under the open sky. His days were long, filled with dust, sun, and the steady rhythm of tending animals and repairing fences. He was not a man who dreamed of wealth. All he wanted was enough land to work, a quiet place to rest at night, and the feeling that his hard work meant something. But life had not been kind to him in recent years. Drought had damaged his grazing land. Prices had fallen, and debt followed him like a shadow he could not escape. One evening, after a tiring day, he stopped by the small county office in a nearby town. He had gone there only to ask about delayed paperwork, but a single piece of paper on a notice board caught his eye. It listed abandoned properties that the county wanted to clear from records. Most were old sheds or land that no one wanted. One line stood out. It mentioned a small wooden cabin, deep in the hills, sold for a symbolic price. The amount written next to it was so small that he thought it was a mistake. 12 cents. He read it again and again, convinced his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. When he asked the clerk about it, the man behind the desk barely looked up. He said the cabin had been empty for years. No one had claimed it. No one wanted it. And the county only wanted it gone from their list. The clerk spoke in a flat voice and warned him that the place was old, damaged, and far from town. He also said, quietly, that locals avoided it. The rancher noticed how quickly the clerk tried to end the conversation. The rancher was not a man who believed much in rumors. To him, fear often came from not understanding something. 12 cents was nothing. Even if the cabin fell apart, at least the land could be used for something useful. He signed the paper, paid the small amount, and walked out with ownership of a place he had never seen. As he stepped outside, the wind felt colder than before, though the sun was still bright. Word travels fast in small towns. By the next day, people already knew what he had bought. At the feed store, conversations stopped when he entered. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with something closer to concern. An older man finally spoke and asked if he knew where that cabin stood. The rancher nodded and said he planned to see it soon. The man shook his head slowly and said it was not a place for living people. When asked why, he only replied that some land remembers pain, even when people try to forget it. Those words stayed with the rancher longer than he wanted to admit. Still, he prepared his truck and set out early the next morning. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and rough. It cut through dry hills and tall, silent trees. The farther he drove, the quieter the world became. There were no birds, no insects, only the sound of tires on dirt and his own breathing. He felt as if he was leaving the present and moving into a forgotten past. After hours of driving, he reached the end of the road. From there, he walked. The cabin appeared suddenly between trees, smaller than he imagined, leaning slightly to one side. Its wood was gray with age, and the roof sagged under years of neglect. The windows were dark, as if they refused to reflect the sunlight. The door hung unevenly, barely held by rusted hinges. He stood there for a long moment, feeling unsure for the first time since buying it. This place did not feel empty. It felt waiting. He pushed the thought away and told himself it was only an old building. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing too long for such a small space. Inside, the air was cold and thick. Dust covered the floor, untouched by footsteps for years. Old furniture sat exactly where it had been left, as if time had stopped. A table stood in the center of the room, one leg broken. A chair lay on its side. There was no sign of animals nesting, no signs of looting. Everything felt preserved in a way that made his skin crawl. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed the ceiling beam. At first, his mind refused to understand what he was seeing. He thought it was a shadow, then an old rope, but as he stepped closer, the truth became clear in a way that stole the breath from his chest. A young Apache woman's body was suspended there, tall and still, her presence filling the room. She looked unreal, like a figure from a story that should not exist. The rancher froze. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. Fear, shock, and confusion mixed together until he could not tell one from the other. He did not approach her. He could not. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and the cabin felt smaller with every second. This was not just a discovery. It was a truth, hidden for far too long. He stumbled backward and rushed outside, gasping for air, as if he had been underwater. The sky looked brighter than before, almost painful to look at. He sat on the ground for a long time, trying to calm his shaking hands. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? How long had she been there? How could something like this be forgotten? When he finally drove back to town, he went straight to the authorities. His voice shook as he explained what he had seen. The officers exchanged glances that told him this was not entirely new to them. They followed him back to the cabin, moving with quiet seriousness. The place was sealed, and the silence around it grew even heavier. That night, the rancher did not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dark room and felt the cold air. He realized that buying the cabin had pulled him into a story much bigger than himself. 12 cents had opened a door to a past filled with pain, silence, and unanswered questions. He understood that his life would never return to the simple routine it had before. This was only the beginning. The cabin was not just an abandoned building. It was a reminder of something buried but not gone, waiting for someone to notice and listen. The morning after the discovery felt heavy and slow. The rancher woke before sunrise, his body tired but his mind restless. The events of the previous day played again and again in his thoughts. He tried to focus on simple tasks, like making coffee and checking his animals, but nothing felt normal anymore. Even familiar sounds seemed distant. He knew that once something like that enters a person's life, it never truly leaves. By mid-morning, officials returned to the area near the cabin. They asked the rancher to stay nearby, but not too close. He watched from a distance as they moved carefully, speaking in low voices. Their calm behavior surprised him. It made him wonder how much they already knew. No one asked him many questions at first. Instead, they told him the process would take time and that he should be prepared for delays. Their words were polite but guarded. Later that day, a woman from the county records office arrived. She carried old folders and worn papers tied with string. She asked the rancher to sit with her under a tree, away from others. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes showed concern. She explained that the cabin had a complicated past. It had changed hands many times on paper, but no one had ever truly lived there for long. Each owner either vanished from the records or gave it up without explanation. She showed him a faded map from decades ago. The land where the cabin stood had once belonged to Apache families before boundaries were redrawn and claims were erased. Names were scratched out, replaced with numbers. Some lines did not match. It was clear that many details had been lost or ignored. The rancher felt a knot in his chest. He realized that the low price he paid was not just about the cabin's condition. It was about people wanting to forget. That afternoon, he drove into town again. The streets looked the same, but he felt different walking through them. People noticed him now. Some avoided his eyes. Others watched him with quiet interest. At a small cafe, an elderly woman approached him. She asked if he was the man who bought the old cabin. When he nodded, she sighed deeply and sat across from him without asking. She told him that when she was young, her parents warned her never to go near that place. They said it was tied to sadness and silence. According to her, many years ago, a young Apache woman had worked in nearby towns, helping families, carrying supplies, and guiding travelers through difficult land. She was known for her strength and kindness. People remembered her height and calm presence. Then one day, she stopped coming. No one asked questions, and life moved on. The rancher listened closely. He did not interrupt. The woman's voice shook as she spoke, as if she had waited years to say these words out loud. She said fear had kept people quiet. Some believed that speaking about the past would bring trouble. Others thought it was better not to reopen old wounds. When she finished, she placed a hand on the table and said the truth had waited long enough. Over the next few days, more stories surfaced. A local historian reached out and shared notes he had collected over decades. He explained that during a time of land disputes, many voices were pushed aside, records were incomplete, and stories were passed quietly from one generation to the next. The young woman's name appeared only once in a damaged ledger, misspelled and marked as unconfirmed. It was as if the system itself had tried to erase her. The rancher felt torn. He had not asked for this responsibility, yet it now rested on his shoulders. He thought about selling the land and walking away, but something inside him would not allow it. He felt connected to the story in a way he could not explain. Perhaps it was because he, too, knew what it meant to struggle and be overlooked. Perhaps it was because silence had already done too much harm. One evening, Apache elders asked to meet him. They chose a quiet place under open sky. The rancher felt nervous but respectful. The elders spoke with dignity and patience. They thanked him for reporting what he found instead of hiding it. They said the young woman was remembered among them, not as a legend, but as a person with hopes and duties. She had helped her community during hard times and carried burdens far heavier than her years. They explained that her disappearance had caused deep pain. Some searched for her, but boundaries, fear, and pressure made it impossible to go far. Over time, grief turned into quiet remembrance. The elders said that places carry memory, and the cabin had been holding on to hers, waiting for someone to listen. The rancher shared everything he knew. He spoke honestly about the auction, the warnings, and his shock. He said he never meant to claim something tied to so much pain. The elders listened without judgment. One of them told him that truth often arrives through unexpected paths. What mattered now was what he chose to do next. As days turned into weeks, the story began to spread beyond the town. Reporters called, but the rancher refused to speak publicly. He believed this was not a story for attention, it was a story for understanding. He focused instead on helping where he could. He allowed historians access to the land, supported the elders' requests, and stayed available for questions. At night, he often thought about the cabin standing alone among the trees. He no longer saw it as a building. To him, it was a witness. It had seen injustice, silence, and neglect. Now, it stood at the center of something that could finally bring clarity. The rancher knew that part 2 of this journey was not about answers yet. It was about listening, learning, and accepting that some truths take time to unfold. He understood one thing clearly. The discovery had changed him. He was no longer just a rancher who bought cheap land. He had become part of a story that demanded care, patience, and respect. And the truth, though slow and heavy, was beginning to rise. As the weeks passed, the focus slowly shifted from shock to understanding. The rancher felt as if he was walking through someone else's memories. Every day brought new details, small pieces of a much larger story. He began spending time reading old documents, listening to recorded interviews, and sitting quietly with people who remembered more than they had ever shared before. The past was no longer distant. It felt close, almost alive. One afternoon, the local historian invited the rancher to his small office. The room was filled with shelves of dusty books and boxes stacked high against the walls. Papers covered the desk, some yellowed with age. The historian explained that many records from the time when the cabin was built were missing or incomplete. Some had been damaged, others intentionally removed. Still, he believed the truth could be found by connecting what remained. Together, they studied old land claims, letters, and notes written in careful handwriting. Slowly, a clearer picture began to form. The cabin had been built during a time of tension, when land was being divided without fairness. Powerful people made decisions quickly, while others were left without a voice. The young Apache woman had lived during this period. She moved between communities, helping families, carrying messages, and offering guidance through difficult terrain. The historian explained that her height and strength had made her stand out, but it was her calm nature that people remembered most. She was trusted by many and respected by her community. Some saw her as a bridge between worlds that did not always understand each other. That role, however, came with risk. Being visible during troubled times often meant becoming a target for blame and fear. The rancher listened carefully, feeling a deep sadness grow inside him. He realized that her story was not just about one person. It reflected a time when many lives were pushed aside. He asked why no one had spoken up sooner. The historian answered honestly. Fear, pressure, and the belief that nothing could change had kept people silent. Silence had become a habit passed down through generations. As more elders shared their memories, the rancher began to understand how pain can become quiet. One elder spoke about how the woman used to sing softly while walking long distances. Another remembered how children followed her, feeling safe in her presence. These were not stories of mystery or legend. They were simple memories of a real human being. Hearing them made the rancher feel both honored and overwhelmed. The land itself seemed to carry these memories. When the rancher walked near the cabin, he noticed things he had missed before. Old footpaths hidden under grass, stones arranged in ways that suggested meaning, marks on trees that looked intentional rather than natural. The land told its story slowly, to those willing to pay attention. Officials continued their work, but progress was slow. Legal questions, paperwork, and disagreements delayed clear answers. The rancher grew frustrated at times, but he reminded himself that the past had been ignored for too long. Taking time now was better than rushing and repeating old mistakes. He stayed patient, even when nights were long and sleep was hard to find. During this period, he began to feel a personal responsibility. He did not cause the injustice, but he was now part of its uncovering. He wondered what he would have done if he had lived during that time. Would he have spoken up? Would he have stayed quiet like so many others? These questions troubled him, but they also pushed him to act with honesty. One evening, he returned to the cabin alone, standing outside as the sun set. He did not enter. Instead, he spoke softly, as if the place could hear him. He said he was sorry for the silence that had lasted so long. He promised that he would not look away. The wind moved through the trees, and for the first time, the area did not feel heavy. It felt calm, almost grateful. The elders later explained that acknowledging the past is an important step. They said that truth is not meant to shame, but to heal. The rancher began to understand that his role was not to fix everything, but to support the process. He offered the land for study and remembrance. He refused any profit from the cabin. To him, it no longer felt like property. It felt like a responsibility. As word spread, more people came forward. Some shared family stories they had never spoken aloud. Others admitted that they had heard rumors but chose not to ask questions. These conversations were not easy, but they were necessary. The town slowly began to change. Silence gave way to reflection. Avoidance turned into quiet acknowledgement. The rancher noticed a shift in himself as well. He was more thoughtful, more aware of the weight carried by places and people. His daily work continued, but his perspective had changed. He no longer saw land as something to own, but as something to respect. Every fence post, every trail, every old structure held meaning beyond its use. By the end of this stage, one truth became clear. The young Apache woman had not been forgotten by chance. She had been forgotten by choice, and that choice was now being undone. Part 3 of this journey was about uncovering what had been hidden, not through force, but through listening. It was about allowing history to speak in its own time. The rancher knew the path ahead would not be easy. There were still unanswered questions and difficult decisions to come. But for the first time since buying the cabin, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than fear. The truth was no longer buried. It was rising, steady and undeniable, carried by voices that had waited far too long to be heard. The deeper the truth came to the surface, the heavier it sat on the rancher's heart. Part 4 of the journey was not about discovery anymore. It was about responsibility. Every conversation, every document, and every quiet moment near the cabin made him understand that knowing the truth changes a person. Once you know, you cannot pretend you don't. The town was changing, slowly but clearly. People who once avoided the subject now spoke about it in low but honest voices. Community meetings were held, not to argue, but to listen. The rancher attended every one of them. He sat quietly most of the time, letting others speak first. He did not want to lead the story. He wanted to support it. Some people were uncomfortable. They felt accused even though no one pointed fingers. A few said the past should stay buried. They believed reopening old wounds would only bring pain. The rancher understood their fear. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges long-held silence. But he also saw how many others felt relief just by speaking. One night, an older man stood up during a meeting and admitted that his father had once warned him never to ask questions about the cabin. He said his family benefited from land that once belonged to others. He did not say it with pride. He said it with honesty. That moment changed the room. It was the first time someone openly accepted the weight of inherited silence. The rancher felt something shift inside him. He realized that responsibility does not always mean blame. Sometimes it simply means choosing to act differently now. He decided that he would not keep the land as a private space. He began working with elders, historians, and officials to decide what should be done next. The Apache elders made one thing clear. This was not about punishment or anger. It was about dignity. They wanted the young woman remembered properly, not as a mystery or a rumor, but as a human being whose life mattered. They wanted the place treated with respect, not fear. Together, they discussed options. Some suggested removing the cabin entirely. Others believed it should remain as a reminder. After long discussions, the elders agreed that the structure should stay, but its meaning must change. It should no longer be hidden or avoided. It should be a place of truth. The rancher offered the land without hesitation. He signed documents that ensured it would never be sold for profit. He knew this decision would affect his finances, but he felt peace for the first time in months. Some things, he learned, are more valuable than money. As work began, the cabin was carefully cleaned and stabilized. Nothing was rushed. Every step was taken with respect. Elders were present, guiding the process. The rancher watched quietly, realizing that the building felt different already. The heavy air he once felt was gone. In its place was calm. At the same time, the rancher faced his own inner struggle. Guilt crept in, even though he had done nothing wrong. He questioned whether he deserved to be part of this healing. One elder noticed his silence and spoke with him privately. The elder told him that being chosen by circumstance does not make someone guilty. What matters is how they respond. Those words stayed with him. He stopped blaming himself for the past and focused on the present. He became a bridge, much like the young woman had once been. He helped people communicate, understand, and move forward together. Media attention grew, but the rancher continued to avoid public spotlight. He believed the story belonged to the community, not to headlines. He refused interviews and asked reporters to respect the elders' wishes. Some criticized him for staying quiet, but others respected his choice. As the weeks passed, a plan formed to hold a remembrance gathering. It would not be large or dramatic. It would be simple, honest, and respectful. The elders explained that healing does not require grand gestures. It requires presence. The rancher helped prepare the land. He repaired paths, cleared debris, and planted native plants around the cabin. Working with his hands gave him comfort. Every small task felt meaningful. The land, once ignored, was being cared for again. The night before the gathering, the rancher stood alone near the cabin. He thought about how a simple decision to buy cheap land had changed so many lives. He realized that some truths wait for the right moment and the right person. Not because that person is special, but because they are willing to listen. He whispered a quiet promise into the still air. He promised that silence would not return. He promised that the story would not be forgotten again. The gathering brought people together from different backgrounds. Some came with heavy hearts, others with curiosity. The elders spoke first, sharing memories and honoring the young woman's life. There were no accusations, no anger, only truth and respect. The rancher stood among the crowd, not in front of it. He felt a deep sense of humility. This was no longer his story. It belonged to everyone who chose to remember. As the sun set, the cabin stood quietly, no longer hidden in shadow. It was not a place of fear anymore. It was a place of acknowledgement. The rancher knew that this part of the journey was about acceptance, accepting the past, accepting responsibility, and accepting that healing is a shared path. Part 4 was not the end. But it was the turning point. The silence that once protected injustice had been broken. Not by force, but by courage and care. And for the first time since buying the cabin for 12 cents, the rancher felt truly at peace. Time moved forward. But it did not erase what had happened. Instead, it gave space for reflection and change. Part 5 was not about endings in the usual sense. It was about what remains after truth is spoken and silence is lifted. The rancher understood that healing is not a single moment. It is a process that continues long after attention fades. After the remembrance gathering, the land felt different. People no longer avoided the path leading to the cabin. Some came quietly to stand near it. Others brought children, not to frighten them, but to teach them. The elders believed that knowledge protects the future better than silence ever could. The rancher often saw families walking the area with calm respect. The cabin was no longer called abandoned. It became a place of memory. A small sign was placed nearby. Written with care and simple words, it spoke about the young Apache woman's life, her strength, and her role in her community. It did not focus on how she was found, but on who she was. This choice mattered. It shifted attention from fear to humanity. The rancher continued his daily work, but he was not the same man he had been before. His movements were slower, more thoughtful. He noticed details he once overlooked, the way the light touched the hills at dawn, the sound of wind through dry grass. He felt more connected to the land, not as an owner, but as a caretaker. People from outside the town still asked questions. Some wanted clear answers, neat explanations, and final conclusions. The rancher learned that real life does not always offer those things. Some questions remain open, not because they are ignored, but because they remind us to stay aware. He answered what he could and stayed honest about what was unknown. One afternoon, a young student visited him. The student said he was writing a paper about local history and wanted to understand how one discovery could change an entire community. The rancher did not speak about himself. Instead, he talked about listening. He said change begins when people choose to hear stories that were once pushed aside. The student asked if the rancher regretted buying the cabin. The rancher thought for a long moment. He then said no. Not because it was easy, but because it mattered. Some paths are difficult, but they lead somewhere important. He said that regret often comes from looking away, not from facing truth. The Apache elders continued to visit the land. They shared stories, songs, and lessons with younger generations. The young woman's name was spoken again, not with sorrow alone, but with respect. She was remembered as someone who helped others, who walked long distances so others would not have to. Her story became part of the living memory of the place. The rancher was invited to join these gatherings, but he never took a leading role. He stayed close, offered help, and listened. He understood that his role was to support, not to speak for others. This humility strengthened the trust between him and the community. As seasons changed, the land reflected that healing does not erase pain, but it softens its edges. Flowers bloomed near the cabin in spring. In summer, shade trees offered rest. In autumn, leaves covered the ground like a quiet blanket. The place felt peaceful, not because the past was forgotten, but because it was acknowledged. One evening, the rancher sat near the cabin as the sun lowered behind the hills. He thought about the 12 cents he had paid. At the time, it seemed like a bargain. Now he understood that the true cost had never been money. It had been attention, courage, and care, and that was a price worth paying. He reflected on how easily stories can disappear when no one protects them. He realized that history is not just written in books. It lives in land, in people, and in choices. Every generation decides what to carry forward and what to leave behind. This time, the choice had been made to carry truth. The town itself changed in quiet ways. School lessons included local history that was once skipped. Conversations became more open. People learned that acknowledging the past does not weaken a community, it strengthens it. By facing what was hidden, they found a deeper sense of connection. The rancher received a letter one day from a relative of the young woman. The letter was short but meaningful. It thanked him for not turning away. It said that dignity had been restored, and that mattered more than anything else. The rancher read the letter several times, feeling both humbled and grateful. As years passed, the story was told less often as a shock and more often as a lesson. It reminded people that truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits quietly, hoping someone will notice. The rancher had been that someone, not because he was special, but because he chose to listen. In the end, the cabin stood as it always had, simple and worn, but its meaning had changed completely. It was no longer a place people feared. It was a place people respected, a place that reminded them that every life matters, and every story deserves to be heard. The rancher knew that his journey with the cabin had reached a natural close. Not because everything was finished, but because it had found balance. He continued his life with a deeper sense of purpose. He carried the lesson with him wherever he went. Some truths come at a cost, others come as a gift. This one had been both. And in honoring it, the rancher and the community found something rare and lasting: understanding. That was the real legacy of the 12-cent cabin. Not shock, not fear, but a quiet promise kept at last.